At least be honest about your objection to the bill. And their objection to the bill is pretty straightforward. They don't want President Trump to get a win.
It's all about Trump to them. This was simply a win for Trump, which they see as a win for their party, the end. The contents, not that important. Marino couldn't fathom that Democrats or regular people like me would have legit objections to indefinite detention of children, or fake nurses in for-profit nursing homes, or millions of people kicked off their health insurance, or a long list of ways in which this law will physically hurt us, whether it's from pollution that they are allowing spewed into our air and water, or the greenhouse gas emissions that threaten all of our homes. No, it's all about Trump. Trump wanted this by July 4th, and he had it by July 4th. What a pathetic flock of sheep the House Republicans are. They knew what they were doing was wrong on a few different levels, and they did it anyway.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend. Thank you for listening to the 320th episode of the Congressional Dish Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And for today's episode, I am going to tell you what's in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And for short, I might refer to it as the BBB, because One Big Beautiful Bill is a lot of words to say, but also because that title is stupid and not actually the real title of what became law. It was stripped out. So this bill doesn't really have a title, but that's what we've all been calling it because that's what President Trump wanted to call it. And so there you go, the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so I read the entire thing. It took me a long time to do. But if you listen to these two episodes, because I am going to break up this information into two episodes because there was a lot in here. Definitely, this would be the longest episode of all time if I kept it all in one, and there was really no detail that I want to skip. But if you listen to these two episodes, you're going to know what's in this law better than pretty much anyone else in the country, because I don't even know where to find this information in this level of detail, at least not in audio form. Just so you know, as I am going to be telling you the numbers in this bill, I've decided that, a lot of these numbers are said to us on a 10-year scale, sometimes a 5-year scale. And so for all of these, I've recalculated them to tell you what the annual numbers would be. Now, obviously, that's going to be ishy. It's kind of average, but I just think that's easier for us to do a comparison if all the numbers are the same. And then along the same lines, I'm also going to be reporting numbers per person. A lot of times in bills and laws, they tell you what the numbers are for singles and then for married couples and then for families. And I'm not going to get into that level of detail. I'm just going to do it all per person, and you can do the multiplications from there. The vast majority of the time, when they're switching it from per person to married, they just double it. So I think you know how to double it if you want to. And of course, I've provided all of this information for you in the show notes, including my copy of the law itself. It is highlighted. I have notes in the margins. And so that should help you if you want to actually dig into it and see this stuff for yourself. But if you appreciate having this level of detail about the Big Beautiful Bill, I would really appreciate it if you would pay for this episode, because this podcast and the team that supports it, we are entirely listener supported. But we also could use your help with marketing because, it's been a very long time that we've been doing this podcast and I've never marketed it. And so we're still a really small show. But I think this is one of those episodes that everyone could benefit from. So also please share this one with any American that you know, really, because I don't know who wouldn't benefit from this. Because this episode is the facts. And my opinion's going to be in here. This is my podcast. And if you don't like my opinions, just ignore them. But I did read every word of this new law, which as far as I know is not something that many journalists are doing. And I also compared the new language to what was law before it passed to see what exactly they changed. Like I said, I have a PDF of my copy of this law in the show notes for you with detailed notes. And the research for this episode took me 3 full work weeks. And I can say with confidence that I now know this new law better than damn near everyone in the world. In fact, I think I know this law better than a lot of members of Congress. And so after you're done listening to this episode and the next episode, you're going to know this law better than just about anyone too. And I think there's value in that. And I will tell you that usually these pitches for funding are generally removed for people who pay for this show regularly on Patreon, which we have on a per episode model. So you only pay for the public episodes. We also have weekly episodes I'm doing now, giving you an update on what happened last week in Congress. And so one of the benefits you get for regularly supporting the show is that you don't have to listen to these pitches. All of these episodes, we don't have any kind of censor over my swear words. And then also you have the bonus content. But this is staying in for this episode for everyone, because I do need to tell you that our funding for the month of July, this is going to air on the last month of July. This is one of the relatively rare months where the Patreon funding of you paying per episode is going to screw me over. And that's because it took me 3 weeks to read this legislation, and I could only get one episode out in July. And so instead of rushing through my work the way Congress did in creating this law, I decided I would just air one this month and the next one will come out in August. But this was a really difficult project. I worked really hard this month, and I will essentially be getting paid half of the Patreon money that I am used to. That is thousands of dollars. That is not going to go into our business bank account here. And so if you appreciate this work, I figured that you should know that doing this cost me thousands of guaranteed dollars. And the only way that I'm going to make that up is from your paper checks or Venmos or Zells or PayPals. But it's the individual contributions that sometimes come in big when I do big projects like this, but not always, And that's the nature of this funding model. It's okay. It's feast and famine, and it's largely out of my control. It's in your control, actually, how much I get paid. And so please pay for the show if you can, because I will say that this is one of the hardest projects I've ever completed for the podcast. The only one I can really compare it to is when I read the Affordable Care Act. Other than that, this one was one of the toughest. I mean, it was 840 pages, and every provision in it was impactful. I've read funding laws before, and people are always amazed by the page numbers because they can be like 1,000, 2,000 pages. But with funding laws, a lot of that is copied and pasted year after year. And so I don't have to study every single page. But this one, I had to study every single page. And I understand why now people don't do this. It's easier to report on who's going to vote on the bill and who's voting against it. The drama, that's fun to report. And sound bites are easier to report than legislation. But this law, this one's going to change our country. And we need to know the details. And most of us will never know the details. And so there are news stories that are coming in the near future that are going to catch most Americans by surprise, but not you and not I. And knowing the changes in laws as impactful as this one, we know from experience that having this knowledge often feels like a crystal ball, which doesn't do us much good sometimes other than just being like, ooh, I knew that was going to happen. But by knowing the legislation, we also know exactly how to fix the problems when the attention is finally drawn to the problems that these bills are going to cause. So when the attention is inevitably drawn towards the child who's been held in a private prison for a month, or towards the nursing home with untrained staff with a high death rate, or towards beloved members of your community who lost health coverage and then died, we're going to know the causes of these stories when we see them. But we'll also know which part of the law to tackle when that time comes that the nation is ready to stop this stuff. There's power in this knowledge, I guess is what I'm saying. And that's what helps me feel better in times like these, when I do feel like I'm watching a disaster unfold and there's nothing I can do about it. Sharing this knowledge is something that I can do. And by sharing this show and by financially supporting it, so can you. That's something you can do. And it is something, and it does matter. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this knowledge with as many people as possible. And so if you want to help with this project, all options for paying are on the support page on congressionaldish.com and in this episode show notes, which is where you're going to find all of our sources. And that doesn't stop with the highlighted PDF of the law. You are also going to have all of our sound clips with timestamps so you can watch them in context, and a bunch of other sources that help me understand what I was seeing as I was reading the law. Because I believe strongly that trust is earned. And so you don't have to agree with my opinions, but you do deserve to check my facts. And I make that as easy as possible for you. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's get started with the big, beautiful bill. So this episode is actually a follow-up to episode 317. That is an episode that I produced after the House had passed their version. There were only two versions of this bill. The House passed a version, and then the Senate passed a version, and then the House, because they were on an arbitrary deadline set by Donald Trump, just passed the Senate version into law. But once I saw the House's version and knew it was going over into the Senate, there were some things in there that I just thought were so bad that we deserved a warning, in the hopes that we might be able to get some of that stuff taken out of the version that would become law. And we did. So I highlighted 5 areas of concern that I had in the original bill, and I am happy to report to you that 2 out of the 5 didn't make it into the final legislation. So first, one of the things we talked about pretty extensively is that there was a provision in the House bill that would have prevented state and local regulation of artificial intelligence technologies for 10 years. And Justin Robert Young, who kind of works with OpenAI, which is the makers of ChatGPT, he's my co-host on my other podcast called We're Not Wrong. And we talked about that extensively on the July 3rd episode of We're Not Wrong. So if you want to hear that, that is on the internet for you. But that was stripped out of the Senate version, and it wasn't even controversial. The stripping out of it passed with a Senate vote of 99-1. Republican Senator Tom Tillis of one of the Carolinas, he was the only person to vote yes on keeping that in the bill. So Congress is, or at least the Senate, is not having this. Although I will tell you that Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri has warned that there are attempts happening right now to attach that to this year's National Defense Authorization Act. So we'll have to be on the lookout for that. But as of right now, even the Republicans in the Senate are not down with that idea, which I consider a very good thing. And just for the record, if you didn't hear We're Not Wrong, Justin considers that a good thing too. No one really is supporting the idea of not being able to regulate AI for 10 years. Another thing that is just not something that is widely supported was a provision in the House bill that would have stopped the judicial branch from enforcing its rulings upon the executive branch, Trump's branch, by making it nearly impossible to issue contempt citations, which are essentially fines and prison time, to administration officials who break the law and refuse to stop. That provision was removed by the Senate parliamentarians, so there was no vote on it. But it wasn't allowed in this because this was passed into law as a reconciliation bill. Reconciliation bills, this is an abuse of the reconciliation process to have such a massive policy changing bill become law this way. But essentially, reconciliation bills are supposed to be edits to the budget. And because they're just supposed to be edits, it's a process that allows bills to get around the filibuster. This is how this was able to become law without any Democratic input whatsoever. And so that is the reason that they use this weird process. But that means that not everything is allowed to be in the bill. And it's the Senate parliamentarian who decides what's in and what's out, what follows the rules and what doesn't. And so that provision, which was purely policy, it clearly had nothing to do with the budget. It didn't survive the scrutiny of the Senate parliamentarian. And that's why it was taken out. Good news is I haven't heard of any attempts to attach this anywhere else. But that one was so bad that we should be on the lookout for this because that is a zombie that I don't want to see come back to life. Okay, that's pretty much all the good news that I've got. Everything else that we talked about in episode 317 survived. And so let's get started with what I consider the worst. Actually, there's a lot in here. Maybe we don't have to rank it, but this is really bad. Because one of the things that survived is the provision that essentially legalizes indefinite detention here in the United States. To give you the full picture, the now big, beautiful law provides an additional $95.5 billion or so for rounding up immigrants to detain and deport. Now, $75 billion of that is just for immigration and customs enforcement, but there are other sections of the bill, like the state and local law enforcement funding sections and the Bureau of Prisons funding and general funding for the Department of Homeland Security Secretary. That is also for kidnapping, moving around and detaining what they call aliens all over this law. So in the press, you're going to hear that there was $45 billion for ICE. It was actually far more than that if you read the law itself and add it all up. But as for the money that went specifically to immigrations and customs enforcement, which I'm going to be calling ICE from here on forward, But the ICE money can be used between now and September 30th, 2029. And so this isn't just for this year. It's going to be available for the entire duration of the Trump administration and for the first 9 months of the next administration. And then the state and local funding is actually available for even longer. But almost $30 billion of that is for hiring new ICE agents and for bringing old ones out of retirement. And it showers these people with bonuses. So like there's retention bonuses for ICE agents who commit to serving for 2 years. Then there's signing bonuses for agents who are hired after this was signed into law and who commit to 5 years. And then they're also going to hire more staff to help with hiring more ICE agents. So it's just they have more money than they have ever had in the history of ICE to expand the size of that part of our government. And there's even some money in the military provisions to help with this effort because it appropriates an additional $1 billion to the military to support Border Patrol and to imprison people on military bases. So don't be surprised if you see that in the news sometime soon. But that's an enormous amount of resources to lock up people in the United States territory. And for context, Immigration and Customs Enforcement is usually funded at roughly $9 billion per year, which they're likely to still get in their annual appropriations. But by adding $95 billion to their funding for capturing, detaining, and deporting people, that's an insane amount of money. And this bill gives them an insane amount of leeway in what they are allowed to do to us after they capture us. And I say us purposefully because all of us are in danger now. Because the devil in the details is that the big, beautiful law now allows the indefinite detention of people that the Trump administration and whatever nightmare administration comes after it decides if a person is here legally and if deemed deportable while they wait to be deported. And so let's zoom in on that first part. The law allows the administration to jail people in private for-profit prisons while they are suspected of being deportable. And there's no time limit on how long the administration can take to figure that out, which means that every single one of us is subject to being jailed indefinitely if the administration says that they think we might be eligible for deportation. It's like, is this person a citizen? Well, I am a citizen, but while they figure that out, they can put me in prison and they can do the same to you. It does not matter if you are a U.S. citizen. In fact, U.S. citizens have already found themselves behind bars. So here's a report from Omar Lewis on KTLA 5 News in Los Angeles from June 27th.
A U.S. citizen who was arrested this week by federal agents has been released from custody. She claims she was targeted because she's Latina.
I was just going to work. It was just a day of work, and everything happened so fast. So, yeah, and they didn't identify themselves, so I was kind of scared.
They're alleging that Ms. Velez assaulted an ICE officer. Now imagine this. You're at a scene, you're just dropped off from work, you're walking along on the curb, on the sidewalk, and a man, a grown adult, 200-pound, 6-foot man in full armor, weapons, with his face shielded, starts charging at you. And that's what she experienced. Now ask yourself, who committed the assault here?
And here's another U.S. citizen victim of an ICE kidnapping, this one caught on camera. This is part of a report by Christian Benavides of CBS News on July 28th.
Wait, that's not how you arrest people. On the ground.
This was the moment Border Patrol and Florida Highway Patrol officers detained a U.S. citizen while conducting immigration enforcement. Kenny Linez, an 18-year-old high school senior, was on his way to work as a landscaper with 2 other co-workers and his mother, who was driving.
I got rights to talk, bro. You got no rights here. I do. Illegal, brother. Get up. I was born and raised here.
They were pulled over for having too many people sitting on the front seat of the car. 2 passengers were undocumented. Officers deployed a taser.
What am I doing? Hey, Kevin!
We're not resisting. We're not committing any crime to, run away.
Linez's phone keeps rolling after he is detained, capturing this exchange between the officers.
Starting to resist more now.
We're gonna end up shooting someone.
Just remember, you can spell that too with a $30,000 bonus.
You've got no rights here. Why? You're an amigo, brother. And the cops also said, if you couldn't hear that clearly, we're going to end up shooting some of them. And by the way, them is us. And as for how long people are being disappeared after these encounters with the Department of Homeland Security, here's a report from CNN's Danny Freeman on July 5th.
This morning, a woman is finally home in Dallas after spending 140 days in ICE custody. Ward Sukik was born in Saudi Arabia to Palestinian parents. She's lived in the United States since she was 8 years old. She was arrested by immigration officials back in February. She was returning from her honeymoon to the U.S. Virgin Islands with her new husband when she was taken into custody.
And you'll notice that she was home because she wasn't deportable. But she spent 140 days, over 4 months, behind bars. And here's that woman, Ward Selik's attorney, named Eric Lee, in that CNN segment on July 5th, the day after the one big, beautiful bill was signed into law, who I think summed up our nation's situation really well.
Well, there's going to be more coming. I mean, how that develops, not only for Ward, but for the tens of thousands of people who every night in this country go to sleep in the conditions that Ward was forced to endure for 5 years, simply for the crime, in most cases, of having been born in another country and trying to come here for a better life. I mean, this is America. There's a network of internment camps across the United States set up by Democratic and Republican administrations where families are detained, where parents are taken from their children. They just built something that they call Alligator Alcatraz, which is as horrific as it sounds. There's Marines in Florida helping ICE attack the rights of immigrants in that state. And they've just passed a bill in Congress, which is not beautiful, which is going to fund ICE to the tune of having more resources at its disposal than many militaries across the world. This is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. We have to really make the point that the situation Ward confronts shows that nobody's safe. They're talking about denaturalizing American citizens. They're trying to enforce what types of speech immigrants can engage in and what types of speech American citizens can listen to immigrants engage in. That is totally outside the American democratic tradition that was embodied in the Declaration of Independence that was signed almost 250 years ago.
And one thing that he mentioned in that, in my opinion, correct summary of where we were on July 5th as a nation, he mentioned that parents were being taken from their children. And so to stop that, the Republican solution in the One Big Beautiful Bill is to clearly allow the children to be indefinitely imprisoned too. Because the Big Beautiful Law says that if the adult that they suspect might be without the proper papers has children, the bill allows the children to be held with the adult in so-called family residential centers. In another part of the bill, they refer to this as promoting family unity, and even admit that they are authorizing the detention of entire families, even though only one person, the adult alien, is, quote, charged with only a misdemeanor offense, unquote, of improper entry. And even worse, the living standards at these so-called family residential centers are going to be determined solely by the Secretary of Homeland Security, who right now is Kristi Noem, who willingly, seemingly proudly, took a picture standing in front of shirtless, caged men, all of whom had their heads shaved, in an image I think will go down in history as shameful as the thumbs up at Abu Ghraib. That picture is the cover image for episode 317, if you haven't seen it. But it's that wicked woman who gets to decide the standards for caging human beings, including children, in family residential centers, or detention centers, or jails, or prisons, or GeoGroup private prisons, or CoreCivic private prisons, or internment camps, or concentration camps, whatever you want to call them, because all of those names fit. And once again, there is no time limit placed on the government that would force the administration to quickly determine a person's status and let us go. Despite the fact that since 1977, since the settlement of a lawsuit known as the Flores settlement, there has been a limit, at least for how long they can hold innocent children in jails. And that limit has been 20 days. And in case you have any doubts that this is the Republicans' intention, the Trump administration has already filed a motion to terminate the Flores settlement agreement, saying that the agreement is, quote, no longer in the public interest, unquote. But congressional legislation trumps judicial settlements anyway. And so the way I read this, I think the One Big Beautiful Bill legalized the indefinite detention of children on United States soil. Because the legalization of indefinite detention of adults on United States soil in for-profit private prisons, that's crystal clear. It definitely did that. But I think it did it for children as well. And so prepare yourselves for the news stories to come. You are going to see stories of innocent children imprisoned in the United States. And the Republican spin will be that it's a humanitarian move in order to keep families together. It's truly monstrous stuff. And if you want to advocate against it effectively, the legalization happened in Section 90003 of the Big Beautiful Bill. That's what needs to be repealed. But considering no one seems to have noticed this, I fear that there's going to be a lot of pain and trauma in this country before a repeal is even on the table. And so, while we're still on the subject of ICE picking on immigrants, let's take a look at what else the law did in this regard. So first, it appropriates an additional $50.7 billion for border infrastructure, including Trump's precious border wall. And that's going to come with all kinds of new technologies, many of them weirdly required to be autonomous. And I can just hear the AI industry rejoicing. So it turns out they did get some favors in the Big Beautiful Bill after all. But for context and to show you what an obscene amount of money this is, in early 2019, during the first Trump administration, after that Congress, which at least had some self-respect, declined to provide the additional funding President Trump requested for his precious southern border wall, only the South, not the North, only the South. But President Trump declared a national emergency and attempted to divert $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense's military construction accounts to pay for border wall construction. Both a federal district court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that this transfer was illegal under the Appropriations Clause since Congress had not authorized the reallocation. But that was a huge fight during the first Trump administration, and it was over $2.5 billion for the wall. And Trump just got $50.7 billion for his wall in his second administration. That's more than the entire Department of Homeland Security and all of its 22 agencies combined usually gets for all of its operations for a full year, at least in normal times. But all of that money, while being spun is for national security, who actually gets the money will be favored construction and tech companies. And that's why this feels so scammy to me. Because the people who actually protect the border are people, Border Patrol agents to be exact. And they get more money too in this law. They get $12 billion in additional funding, including over $2 billion for Border Patrol bonuses. But the comparison to me is stunning. Over $50 billion for wall construction and all the fancy tech, and $12 billion for the humans who do the work. It just feels like a transfer of public money to private pockets, which we've seen at the Department of Homeland Security and their security theater since the Department of Homeland Security was invented by the George W. Bush administration. Remember Michael Chertoff? He was one of the first secretaries of Homeland Security. I think he might have been the second one, but he was a George W. Bush administration guy. And when he left the Department of Homeland Security, he formed the Chertoff Group, which is a consulting firm. And that firm represented the company that sold the TSA all of those full body scanners that we have to walk through every time we fly. Tens of millions of dollars funneled to his preferred companies. And this border wall and infrastructure situation just seems designed to set up more sweetheart deals for Trump world-connected contractors, just like the George W. Bush administration hooked up Michael Chertoff's company, allegedly. And one of the reasons that I think this is because the strategy for dealing with illegal immigration in this law just doesn't match what we know here at Congressional Dish has been requested for years by the officials who have had to deal with illegal immigration, specifically that they have requested an army of immigration judges to process all of these cases more quickly. That's why people end up here for years waiting for their day in court. We don't have enough judges. We have known this since at least 2017. And so the Big Beautiful Law does provide the Attorney General with $3.3 billion for, in part, hiring immigration judges. But the law caps the number of judges at 800, even though a 2023 report by the Congressional Research Service concluded that we need at least 1,300 judges. So why would you cap the number of judges. Why would you cap it at all? But why would you cap it 500 judges below what is needed if the goal is to really solve this problem? The only reason that I can think of for doing this is to accomplish a different goal, which appears to me to be the mass long-term imprisonment of people, which serves to enrich the private for-profit companies that own the prisons and to enrich the real estate and construction companies that will build new prisons. But I think the real goal here is that this administration and the Republicans who have proven themselves to be willing co-conspirators very clearly, they seem to think that cruelty seems to serve as an immigration deterrent. And so I think the cruelty is the goal. Because if it weren't, they wouldn't cap the number of judges. They would want these people processed quickly so that they and their children wouldn't have to spend a lot of time behind bars. But I think stopping immigration in general, I think that's really the goal. And I think the cruelty is the point. Because it's clear that they don't want foreigners, aliens, coming here. And that is also proven to me by the financial hurdles that they put up in the Big Beautiful Law to illegal and legal immigration. I think these financial barriers are proof. So let's take a look at those. So anyone who is deemed inadmissible and who arrives at the border outside of a port of entry, who just shows up in the wrong place, even if they turn themselves in, if they are apprehended, they will be charged $5,000 or whatever the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem wants to charge, whichever is more expensive. And that fee will automatically increase every year with inflation. But for people with legal rights to try and come here by claiming asylum, so these are like truly desperate people trying to escape something horrific wherever they came from. Well, Republicans are now requiring a fee to be paid by anyone seeking asylum for even attempting to apply. So the application fee is going to be $100 or whatever the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, or the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, want it to be, whichever amount is higher. That fee will also automatically increase every year with inflation, and there is no way to waive the fee. And then, each year that asylum seeker is here waiting for their turn in court, which again will be longer because the number of judges that can be hired was capped, well, during that waiting period, they will have to pay another $100 fee to renew their application. A $100 fee, or however much the Department of Homeland Security Secretary wants, whichever is more. This fee will automatically increase with inflation and can't be waived or reduced. In addition to those fees, anyone who is paroled into the United States, so anyone who is allowed out of prison to start their life pending an immigration hearing, has to pay another fee. And that fee is at least $1,000. Or however much Kristi Noem wants to charge, whichever is more. This fee will also increase automatically with inflation. And this fee, like the others, can't be waived or reduced. Although I will say that for this one fee, there is a list of situations. So like medical situations, or if the person is a witness to a crime and the government needs them here to testify. There is a list of extreme circumstances where a person can't go through the usual visa process. There are a list of circumstances where they won't get hit with this fee. But for a person who is just trying to make a life here and escape something terrible, they will have to pay this fee. And then, in addition to those fees, there is a special fee just for the kids. So if anyone wants to bring their kid here, it's going to be a $250 fee, or however much the Department of Homeland Security Secretary wants to charge, whichever is more. And that fee will again automatically increase every year with inflation. And that is the only one, the fee for the kids, that might be able to be waived or reduced. They didn't prohibit it in the law. But to start a life here, there will then be another fee that these people will have to pay for an employment authorization while they wait, and that fee is even more expensive. The fee to try to get a job here will be at least $550, or whatever amount Kristi Noem wants it to be, whichever amount is higher. Do you see a trend here? And there's also no way for this employment authorization fee to be waived. Oh, but that's not the end of the fees. For each year that these people want to renew their employment authorization, they will have to pay another fee, which will be $275, or however much Kristi Noem wants it to be, whichever amount is more. That fee will increase automatically with inflation and can't be waived or reduced. And again, many of the people who are going to be hit with these fees are desperate people. And so how is someone seeking asylum supposed to come up with at least $1,650, which includes the fee to apply to be here, the fee to be paroled, the fee to legally work here, when they are fleeing their country and have no job yet? And that's just the starting number, because all of these fees will automatically increase with inflation if Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi decide not to make them higher. But do you think that these witches really want to help these people out, or do you think they'll use their authority to make those fees more? Because there is no cap on any of these fees. Those are just minimums. And so basically, these people can charge whatever they want to deter immigrants with financial cruelty. And on top of that, if these people dare to use our court system to make sure that they are being treated according to our laws, they're going to have to pay out of pocket for that privilege too. So first, if a person is order removed by a court and they are not present, and then they have to be arrested by the Department of Homeland Security for deportation, they're going to be hit with a fee of either $5,000 or whatever the DHS secretary wants to charge, whichever is more expensive. And of course, that amount will increase with inflation and can't be waived or reduced. But for this particular one, fine. These are people who are not following our laws, are not showing up to court. We do have to go capture them. We do have to pay to deport them. And so this is a way of us being reimbursed for that. But in the United States, we are supposed to all have our cases heard in court. And so if a person is showing up to court dates, and if that person is found to be inadmissible and wants to apply to have that ruling waived, there's a fee for the application. And it's going to be $1,050 minimum, or of course, whatever the Attorney General wants to charge, whichever is more expensive. And that fee will also increase with inflation. There's also a fee if a person wants to appeal a decision of a judge that they are inadmissible, or a decision of a Homeland Security officer. That fee for having their day in court is going to be $900, or whatever the Attorney General wants to charge, whichever is more expensive, which increases with inflation. And even if a person wins in court, if a person wants to apply to have their deportation order suspended, there's going to be a fee to file that application. That's going to be at least $600, or whatever the Attorney General wants to charge, whatever is most expensive. And that fee will increase with inflation. And if a person wants an immigration court to cancel their removal order and adjust their legal status, there's an application fee for that too. And that one's going to be $1,500, or whatever the Attorney General wants to charge, whichever is more expensive. And the fee will increase with inflation. This is not about poor asylum seekers. For people in the process of being granted temporary protected status, there was already a fee for them. But that fee is being increased by 10 times. It is jumping from $50 to $500, and that fee will also automatically increase with inflation. It's another one that can't be waived or reduced by law. And then if a person wants to apply to be a permanent resident, there's another fee. This time the Attorney General gets to charge $1,500, or however much she wants, whichever is more. And that fee will again increase with inflation. These are the types of fees and permissions to increase fees that you would only enact if you want to essentially shut down as much immigration as possible. And clearly, if this is being applied to people trying to be permanent residents, clearly that includes legal immigration too. I mean, hell, they even discourage tourism in this new law. And so that's done with two different fees. First of all, there's going to be an increase in the electronic system for travel authorization fee. Now, this is paid by people who don't need a visa to come here for 90 days. So like people from Europe. And that fee is going to jump from $21 to $40. Not a huge deal. The other one is the bigger deal, because anyone who wants a visa to enter the United States is going to have to pay now $250, or whatever the Department of Homeland Security Secretary wants to charge, whichever is more. But that amount, so $250 is the minimum, but that amount will go up with inflation automatically every year, and that fee can't be waived or reduced. The only thing about this fee that might help us with the tourism industry is that the Department of Homeland Security Secretary is allowed, not required, but allowed to refund the fee if the tourist complied with all conditions of their visa, like if they didn't work while they were here, or if they didn't try to overstay their visa by more than 5 days. But if Kristi Noem decides to keep the money, she's allowed to do that too. These are just not things that you do if you want immigrants or tourists coming to your country. And as fun as it is to blame the Trump administration for all of this, it was the congressional Republicans that did it. This is Republican Party policy. This isn't all about Trump. Okay, so that was the immigration section. The next danger that I warned you about when I saw the House version of the big, beautiful bill was the danger that it posed to our environment. And the version that became law is an absolute environmental disaster. Because this law is taking us backwards in terms of doing our part as citizens of the world to slow the off-the-charts rate of change that our global climate is currently experiencing. We are already worst in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per person. Dead last worst. And this law is going to take us in the wrong direction. I am so ashamed of how this law is going to sabotage the efforts of everyone else in the world to tackle this problem. And it does so by taking money away from damn near all of our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gases as a nation and to help companies in the US reduce theirs. To be specific, they systematically dismantled the progress made by the inappropriately named Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the first laws that I read while producing this podcast over the last 13 years that made me think that Congress would actually do some good in this world. And so first, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and all of the money that was left in it, gone. The remaining diesel emission reductions funding, gone. The remaining money for reducing carbon and methane emissions from the agricultural industry, gone. Although I will say, because I promise you, I am looking for every single silver lining in here. Anything that I consider good in this law, I want to tell you about. It's just really hard to do. But the law does increase annual appropriations for conservation programs. It also adds $100 million a year for watershed protection and flood protection. But if you look at the numbers, the amounts added by that section are far lower than the amounts in the same section that takes away from efforts to reduce carbon and methane emissions in agricultural production. So even the good news in this bill, this law, is net bad news. At least if you're someone who cares about breathing clean air, drinking clean water, and keeping our cities out of the sea. But along those lines, let's get back to the bad. Because the big, beautiful law rescinds whatever is left of the money given to the National Forest System to manage old growth forests and to small forest owning landowners for climate resilience work and planting more trees. Which is bad because if we're going to use our tax code to encourage the burning of fossil fuels, which we are, you will learn all about that in great detail in the next episode. But one of the most effective ways to mitigate that damage of burning fossil fuels is to plant trees. But the Republicans have chosen to do the opposite because on top of defunding the effort to plant more trees, the one big beautiful law forces the Secretary of Agriculture in this administration and the next one and half of the administration after that to sell timber on national forest land in an amount that is 250 million board feet more than whatever was sold the year before. And so it requires more and more trees to be cut down every single year. And the sales must be done via at least 40 private sector contracts, and each of those contracts has to be for 20 years, forcing future administrations to either continue this policy or waste our money breaking the contracts, which would make the Lorax cry. And that's not all. There's a similar requirement for the Secretary of the Interior to sell 20 million board feet of timber from public lands every year, more than what was sold the year before, for the next decade. The Secretary of the Interior will be forced to privatize the work of disposing the vegetation on public lands to at least 5 private companies, which is one of many examples of policies serving also as corporate welfare, which you will also learn about in great detail in the money episode that I will be producing next about the big, beautiful law. And speaking of corporations, this new law also helps them hide their emissions by taking back funding to standardize a process for corporate greenhouse gas reporting. And they take back funding to collect data on the impacts of pollution and temperature rise. And they take back funding to test the public health effects of fuels and fuel additives. And we've seen this strategy in Republican bills going back to the beginning of Congressional Dish in 2012. Republicans consistently attempt to stop studies that are likely to prove their policies harmful. So they have a policy of letting corporations emit unacceptable levels of pollution and greenhouse gases. And so they're going to stop those reports from corporations. They have a policy of allowing fossil fuel burning, which increases pollution and increases global temperatures. So they stop collecting pollution and temperature data. They have a policy of allowing fossil fuel burning and the burning of dangerous chemical additives, which negatively affects public health. We know it does. And so they're just going to stop testing those effects. And I think a lot of people, if they were to look at the Republicans' pro-pollution actions, which I do think don't get nearly enough scrutiny by our national media, but when they look at this, a common reaction that I hear when I talk about it is, why would they do that? I don't understand. It doesn't even make sense. But it does make sense because the Republicans represent corporate polluters. And if you look at their actions from that framing, even if you hate what they do, and I don't think I am in any way hiding my hatred, but it does make perfect sense. And so here's something, now that we have that framing in our heads, knowing that this makes sense if you see them as the representatives of corporate polluters, even though the consequences will be terrible for all coastal states, including the red states in the South, the Republicans in their big, beautiful bill took back all remaining money from the Inflation Reduction Act for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for coastal states for the protection of coastlines to help them prepare for extreme storms, including money for NOAA hiring and training, NOAA research. NOAA is the abbreviation for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But they took back money for hiring NOAA's staff, for their research, for their modeling, for their forecasting, and for dissemination of information to the public. Now, I just look at this in terms of policy, and I can see how clearly dangerous this is for all of us. And I was at the Republican National Convention, and I can promise you that they did not run on defunding accurate storm forecasts. And yet this is what they are doing, even though it's not what people voted for. It doesn't make sense if you care about your constituents, but it does make sense if you look at the Republicans for what they clearly are, and that is representatives of fossil fuel corporations. And so how does this serve them? Well, if they can't credibly deny that the climate is changing faster than any other time in human history, which they can't deny because it is, then they can gut the agency that does that research. They can limit the proof. And so the storms will come. And people will die. Their constituents will die. But NOAA won't be able to measure the effects as well, and the fossil fuel companies win. It makes sense as a strategy. When the facts don't align with the ideology that funds your campaigns or your bank accounts, hide the facts. That's the goal. Hide the facts. The destruction of our homes and businesses and our deaths, those are just unfortunate side effects that they just aren't bothering to prevent. Thoughts and prayers. And that goes beyond the storms that their actions will make stronger and that we will now be less prepared for. The pollution itself is dangerous, and they are just as reckless about our health in that regard. So the remaining funding to address air pollution, that is the name of the fund, gone. The remaining funding to reduce air pollution at schools, gone. The remaining funding that would have improved energy efficiency, reduced water use, and improve indoor air quality in apartment and condo buildings in our homes, gone. And their reign of negligence goes even beyond humans, because the remaining money for planning to help endangered species survive, that's also gone. I mean, this is like fairy tale villain level evil, what they did in this law, even if it does make sense. And then there's the cherry on top, because I love national parks. I think that they are American treasures. They are vast open lands, which are pristine. And it's something that a lot of other countries just don't have. Like Europe is another part of the world that I deeply love, but it's just too small. It's too crowded. We have these great outdoors that we have protected. They are unique American gems. But Republicans took away what was left of Inflation Reduction Act money for the National Park Service and for the Bureau of Land Management, Conservation, Protective, and Resiliency of their lands and resources. Now, when it comes to the National Park Services that they are defunding, you know, those are the services that keep the parks clean, that provide restrooms and information centers, that make these parks not only wonderful for us to enjoy, but bring in billions of dollars per year in tourism. And so cutting this money means cuts to the National Park Service employees and to National Park Service maintenance. Now, that's bad enough. But the section that comes after these cuts to the National Park Service, it then appropriates $150 million back to the National Park Service. And this money, it has a specific use. So this can only be used through 2028 for events and celebrations for celebrating the 250-year anniversary of the founding of the United States. Now, this is how they funded Trump's birthday military parade. And this is how they will be able to fund any additional ones that Trump wants to throw to impress Kim Jong-un over the next 3 years. Those are the priorities in this law, and they make sense. The Republicans, damn near all of them now, are subservient to Donald Trump. It's weird, but in that context, it does make sense. It's just so clear that they aren't really working for us. And so that's the part that just feels broken, right? That's the part that feels like it shouldn't make sense, because as someone who was born and raised in the United States, it's not supposed to be like this, not here. You know, we're supposed to be represented by the people that we vote for. And yet, something we all love, our national parks, you know, something we all value and that keeps us all safe, accurate weather forecasts, something we all need, storm preparation, all of those get cuts while Trump parades get $150 million. You know, it's not supposed to be like this. My brain understands it. But the pain of seeing all of this, it's in my heart. And unfortunately, the attacks on the environment continue in the tax policy sections. And so I'll be telling you all about those in the next episode. And when I think about the full-on assault on energy efficiency and pollution controls in this new law, one of the reasons that I care so much is because it's going to affect all of our health. This is one that we can't run away from. And you would hope that if they were going to allow industry to poison us, they would at least make healthcare easier to access and make it more affordable. But that was not the choice that was made by the Republicans in this Congress. They chose to do the exact opposite. And so we're going to talk about healthcare now. And so let's get started with an update on the healthcare-related warning that I gave you in episode 317 about nursing home staffing, because that shameful provision survived and is now law. And so as I explained in the warning episode, Republicans successfully slipped in a dingleberry to help private equity vultures who bought nursing homes and are profiting at the expense of our elderly loved ones' safety. Because it's estimated that about 13% of nursing homes in the United States are owned by private equity firms now. And that is a percentage that's increasing. And that's concerning because private equity firms exist purely to extract profit from businesses they buy and often destroy, because they tend to buy a thriving business, fire the workers, skimp on maintenance, sell off parts of it, and pocket all the savings. And if the business isn't destroyed in that process, they leave the remaining employees to do much more work with fewer resources. And that's what's been happening in nursing homes that get gobbled up by private equity vultures. And in 2024, during the Biden administration, the Department of Health and Human Services released a report that found that private equity firms' ownership of nursing homes has led to an 11% increase in patient deaths, partly due to, quote, aggressive staffing cuts and hiring inadequately credentialed staff, unquote. And so, in response to that report, the Biden administration created a regulation with minimum staffing requirements, including a rule requiring that a nurse be on duty 24/7 and requiring that nurses in nursing homes have valid nursing licenses if the nursing home wants to be eligible for Medicaid and Medicare funding. And that seems like pretty basic stuff to me, requiring nurses to be qualified nurses if they are going to get our tax money. But Republicans attacked that regulation in their big, beautiful bill, representing shady, cost-cutting businesses instead of our elderly family members. And to be exact, because they couldn't repeal the regulation entirely for procedural reasons. Remember, this whole bill was done under reconciliation, and there are rules. That would have broken the rules. And so what they did instead is they prohibited the regulation from being enforced for the next decade. It can't be enforced until the end of 2034. But that was just one attack on our healthcare system. This law is going to affect a lot more people, a lot more broadly, by making healthcare coverage harder to get. So first, they're coming for the families of the federal workforce. Because the big, beautiful bill requires that the director of personnel management, who is a guy named Scott Kapoor, this is a venture capital guy, aka a Bay Area tech douche with no HR experience, who is one of the few confirmations that didn't even get unanimous Republican support in the Senate. But that guy has vowed to get workers out of government, and during his confirmation hearing, he refused to protect government workers' rights, their collective bargaining rights specifically. Which brings me to Section 90101 of the Big Beautiful Law, which requires that guy to conduct an audit of the family members who are covered right now on the federal employee health benefits plans, and requires that guy to create a process for any family member that they deem unfit for some reason to get kicked off of their health insurance plan. Now, the process for kicking people off of their insurance needs to be in place by the end of this year. But the audit isn't required to be done until July 4th, 2029, which is actually after the Trump administration will be over. But there's nothing stopping them from finishing early if the guy who promised to make working for the government suck is inclined to do so. Another strategy of Republicans to get fewer people to claim government-provided healthcare coverage is to make the process of claiming their coverage as sucky as possible. So in this country, Medicaid is essentially healthcare for people who have run out of money. And since we have a lot of elderly people in this country who have no pensions and no savings, but lots of illnesses that come with old age, we have a lot of elderly people whose healthcare is paid for by Medicaid as well. And a lot of people who have their healthcare coverage thanks to Medicaid often aren't even aware of it because Medicaid is usually not the name of their healthcare plan because federal Medicaid money is given to the states, and it's the states that actually run the programs that provide the healthcare. So like in California, Medicaid coverage is called Medi-Cal. In Illinois, it's called Health Choice Illinois. In Massachusetts, it's Mass Health. In Tennessee, it's TennCare. In Louisiana, it's Health Louisiana. You get the idea. It's lots of different names, but all of them are actually Medicaid. Well, the Republicans, in the name of saving money for the federal government, are putting up hurdles for people to have to jump over to get the Medicaid that they actually qualify for. So starting in 2027, now I do want to take a moment to pause and talk about that date. None of this stuff starts until after the midterm elections. Now, I think that is a strategy for the Republicans to not have to deal with the effects of this until after the next election. But there's another way to look at this, which is that this can be stopped. If we vote differently, as in we vote for people who would not do this, we can stop these cuts from going into effect. So let's just keep that in mind. But this is the intention. This is the law. This would have to be changed with another act of Congress. So starting in 2027, a person must prove to the state that they either worked, so performed community service. It doesn't necessarily have to be work for a corporation, but they have to perform community service, which is usually for free, or go to school for at least 80 hours per month. So that's 20 hours per week. That's part-time. And they need to be making at least minimum wage to keep qualifying for health coverage. And it's that part. Like it says that they can perform community service, but that's usually done for free. And you usually don't get paid to go to school. And so if they have to be making at least minimum wage, this is a funnel to get people to work for cheap for corporations. That's the way I see it. Now, there are some exemptions here. So like people are exempt from this requirement if they're under the age of 19, if they were in prison for some part of that month, if they are a disabled veteran, if they're blind, if they have a substance use disorder and they're currently in a treatment program, if they're mentally ill, if they have a serious medical condition, if they're pregnant, or if they have a child under the age of 13. Because a couple times in this new law, they basically act like 14-year-olds are adults who can care for themselves now. But then finally, there's another exemption, which is if this person is caring for a disabled family member. And then also on top of those exemptions, the states are allowed, not required, but allowed to deem a person exempt from the work requirements if they were hospitalized for part of that month, if they live in a county that has been declared a disaster area by the president, or if they live somewhere where the unemployment rate is above 8% or 1.5 times the national unemployment rate average. But that being a may and not a shall means that the Trump administration can decide to enforce work requirements upon a person that was just in the hospital. They can enforce work requirements on someone who is living in a declared disaster area or is living somewhere where there aren't enough jobs for everyone who wants them. And they can take away a person's health care if they can't comply. And speaking of compliance, the law expressly gives states permission to require proof of compliance more than twice per year, which is a hassle. But the state is required to use payroll data or other data that can be submitted without paperwork from the enrollee if that's possible. That's one tiny silver lining. But if a person didn't work 80 hours in a month, or can't prove it, or doesn't submit the paperwork over and over and over again, the state will send a notice of noncompliance, and the individual will have 30 days from the receipt of that notice to either show that they've worked or that they don't legally have to. But if they don't do that, if they don't submit that paperwork at the end of the month following the 30 days end, they will lose their healthcare coverage. And due to the paperwork hassles and inability for some people to comply, it's estimated that approximately 5 million Americans are going to lose their healthcare coverage. And so here's a good exchange between Democrat Mary Gay Scanlon of Pennsylvania and Democrat Frank Pallone about how government work requirements function as an effective hurdle, which will result in financial savings caused by 5 million fewer Americans having health coverage. Now, this conversation occurred in the Rules Committee debate, which was the only debate that Republicans allowed on the final bill. This was on July 1st. So it's like the final bill passed the Senate in the middle of the night, on the night of June 30th, going into July 1st. Then the House Rules Committee immediately met. They didn't even have the final text when the meeting started. And so this is the context behind these discussions. And I really enjoyed these discussions because these people were tired, they were pissed off, and they really weren't mincing any words on either side of the aisle. So this is the conversation that was had between the Democrats about the work requirements.
We've heard so much about the work requirements in this bill for Medicaid or SNAP, but particularly Medicaid, being necessary to address fraud. But I was doing a lot of research this weekend, and every time we hear about a big Medicaid fraud case, it's not the people who are the recipients of Medicaid who are the ones committing the fraud. It's the insurance companies, it's the medical providers, it's the doctors, it's the healthcare systems that are committing billions worth of fraud. How will work requirements on recipients address the bulk of Medicaid fraud?
Well, the report that came out that talked about fraud, as you said, I think it was from CMS, and it basically was talking about the insurance companies. It wasn't the people themselves. So that's obviously clear. To put it in simplest terms, I think what this paperwork does, right, is it makes you file as much as once a month to keep getting your Medicaid and say that you're working, right? But you can, and you know, the people that are actually working, it's a burden because they have to do it every month and they may miss it and then they're out, right? But I think the bigger problem is the fact that if you want an exception to that because you're disabled, because you're pregnant, or the various categories they put in, those are extremely strict, right? So let's use an example. Like if you're disabled and you want to get Social Security disability, right? That's a very stringent test, right? There are a lot of people who don't meet that test, but still are disabled and can't work or can't work enough, right? Those people, the way I see the definition, they're out, right? So what they've done is they put all this paperwork and burdens on people that even if you think you can qualify an exception, you're not going to be able to. And that's what happened in Georgia. That's why in Georgia you had those 300,000 or 400,000 people that were eligible for Medicaid expansion, but only 4,500 actually qualified, not because they weren't, they actually weren't able to work. Maybe you're taking care of a relative, right? And that's a category that's in there, but how do you actually prove that, you know, because these are so stringent, that that's legitimate? I mean, this is the problem.
And for another glimpse into the cruelty of the work requirement policy, here's an exchange that begins with some straight bullshit from Republican Representative Jason Smith of Missouri, followed by Democratic Representative Teresa Lager Fernandez, and then finally Representative Gwen Moore, who's a Democrat from Wisconsin.
If they're working, they're not going to lose their Medicaid. And that's energy and commerce, but that's the case.
I don't know. Ranking, can we?
Unless they're illegal.
I'm going to ask Gwen Moore if she would like to join the conversation.
That's not true. Part of the problem is that they'll hit, there's marginal tax rates. So in my state, for example, you qualify for Medicaid or Badger Care if you're at or below 100% of the poverty level. So you could go to work for minimum wages, that would push you over the 100% of the poverty level. You know, if you made $16,000 a year, you would no longer be eligible for Medicaid. You'd be working yourself into poverty.
It's such a catch-22. Like $16,000 a year is, I mean, you know, it's impossible to live on. I cannot imagine. But you have to make under that, at least in her state, to have health coverage from Medicaid, to have tax money financed healthcare, which, by the way, is the standard for the rest of the civilized world. But if you make over that incredibly low amount, you lose your coverage. And so if you follow the work requirement, like, play this out. Let's say you have a 14-year-old kid who is still not adult by like most of our terms, but let's say that you work part-time so that you can meet the work requirement and still be an effective parent. But you don't get employer-provided health care from a part-time job. And so if the minimum wage brings you $1 over the desperate poverty line, you lose the health coverage that you're going to work to try to secure. You know, if you or someone in your family has any kind of condition that requires healthcare, and like, who doesn't, what are you supposed to do? This is designed to kick people off their healthcare. It's that simple, and they call it savings. And here's a Republican explanation for his support for the work requirements that they know are going to cause their own constituents to lose their health coverage, whether it's because these people can't clear the hurdles or if they take a part-time, no benefits job, and that brings them just beyond desperate poverty. Here's House Republican Glenn Thompson of Pennsylvania in the Rules Committee.
Keeping people comfortable, stuck in poverty, making poverty a spider web where there's no chance for the American dream is just absolutely wrong. And, you know, and a lot of what we're working on in this bill actually is focused, the things I've worked on in this bill is, so I just speak for myself, is really focused in providing those ladders of opportunity, providing those encouragements.
Cutting people off from health coverage isn't a ladder of opportunity. A ladder of opportunity would be a jobs program. So like creating projects that people, regardless of their qualifications, could be hired to do by the government and be paid. A ladder of opportunity would be taxpayer-funded education. A ladder of opportunity would be providing housing and more than enough food and health coverage, basically providing the bottom pillar of Maslow's hierarchy of needs so that people are able to move towards self-actualization. But it's really hard to better yourself when you don't know if you're going to have what you need, like shelter, food, medicine, the basics of survival. Cutting people off from healthcare coverage and food, as we will get to in a second, that's not a ladder of opportunity. You work or else, that's a punishment. And Republicans saying it is meant to help, that's spin. That's a lie. Safety nets are supposed to catch people, not throw them harder and faster to the ground. And so now let's get to the food, because medical coverage is not the only life essential that is being essentially withheld from people who can't figure out how to walk the line between extreme poverty with benefits and poverty with no help. So in order to get SNAP food benefits, people need to work 20 hours per week. That was already law. But the one big beautiful law removed some of the exceptions. So before, the work requirements in return for food ended at age 55. Now they're going to end at age 65. And before, a parent with a dependent child was exempt. Now, only parents with children under the age of 14 will be exempt from work requirements. And like, since when are high school freshmen adults who don't need a parent at home? Before the one big beautiful law, homeless individuals, veterans, and people under the age of 24 who were in the foster care system when they turned 18, they were exempt. Now, there's no exemptions for any of them. So how's that for supporting the troops? And also, on the state level, the state could get a waiver from work requirements for their residents if the state had an unemployment level over 10%. Now, that remains. But also if the state did not have a sufficient number of jobs to provide employment to all of the individuals who were looking. And it's that second part, exempting states that don't have enough jobs for everyone, that was removed from our law. And so people can be denied food benefits due to not working, even if there are no jobs for them to do. And the Republicans call these work requirements community engagement instead of forced labor. But that's what it is. It could also be called involuntary servitude, which is when a person is forced to work against their will under threat of punishment or coercion. Forcing labor by withholding medical care seems to me to fall into this category, and it's a violation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which says, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction," unquote. And right now, being poor is not a crime in the United States. And yet this law and laws that came before it, this is just a continuation of an unconstitutional trend. But this law forces labor by withholding medical coverage and food. It's a form of economic violence. You either work for a company for less than a living wage, which is what our minimum wage is, or you go without health care and some food benefits. It's fucked up. And make no mistake that getting people to work for companies is the goal. Even though the allowance of going to school helps them get around the 13th Amendment. But this is for the companies. It's a pipeline of cheap labor, which is needed since they are now deporting everyone who is providing the below living wage labor up until now. And here's just one example of how I can so confidently say that. Here's Republican Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina saying who the forced labor is really for. This was in the Rules Committee meeting.
And to have my good friend, Mr. McGovern, question whether they were really people who are able-bodied, and it's not that many of them, you hadn't been in the real world. You go to that restaurant, you go to that electrician, you go to that tire manufacturer. Every day, the number one concern is getting people who are willing to do hot work. It's not there. You've been in government too long.
They're doing this to help the companies get cheap labor. And I want to take a minute right now to dive into the political drama of how this bill became law, because while Ralph Norman's concern is purely about the bosses in his district, and he seems to have little regard for the workers who will lose their health care coverage and food allowances, that was not true for Senator Lisa Murkowski, who is a Republican senator from Alaska, who has a proven history of giving a shit. Because during the first Trump administration, during the Republicans' last coordinated attack on our healthcare system, it was John McCain, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski who were the Republicans who saved the Affordable Care Act with their no votes on a horrendous bill that would have freed the health insurance companies to fuck us over for profit even more than they already can. Now, I read their bill that they were trying to pass, and so you can listen to Congressional Dish 151 from 2017 to get the details about that averted disaster. But in that saga, Senator Lisa Murkowski proved that she has somewhat of a conscience, and she was not cool with the work requirements provisions in this bill. And so in order to get Senator Murkowski to vote for this evil bill, she got a provision included in here that quite clearly was designed to benefit just her state. Because they actually tried to get this to just benefit her state of Alaska. But the Senate parliamentarian ruled that granting a favor to a single state was not allowed. And so this favor is actually going to apply to the non-contiguous states, which means Hawaii and Alaska. But the favor is that the Trump administration is allowed, not required, but is allowed to grant exemptions from work requirements for food to the non-contiguous states of Hawaii and Alaska. If the state says, pretty please, and if the secretary says that they made a good faith effort to comply, which is obviously all kinds of subjective. But what's wild about this is that this exemption can be removed by the Trump administration at any time, and under no circumstances will Alaska and Hawaii be exempt past December 31st, 2028. So this only goes through the Trump administration. And so basically, Senator Murkowski sold out hungry people all over the country just to let the Trump administration have enormous leverage over her for the rest of his term. But to be fair for her, this wasn't the only favor granted to her in the big, beautiful law. And so we'll get to the big Alaska favor in a bit, because this wasn't it. But let's get back to the paperwork hurdles that were placed between us and our taxpayer-funded safety net benefits, because there was another one in here, and this one affects Medicare, which is essentially healthcare for old people. And this attack on our system was done the same way that they are allowing private equity firms to get away with having part-time fake nurses in their for-profit nursing homes. It's a regulation moratorium. And so until the end of September 2034, the one big beautiful law prohibits enforcement of a rule created by the Biden administration to reduce paperwork to make it easier for people on Medicare to get healthcare benefits. Basically, the Biden administration's idea was that when someone applied for one part of Medicare coverage, they would automatically be enrolled in other parts of Medicare and Medicaid that they were eligible for. It also limited the amount of documentation that states could demand, the lack of which could be used to deny coverage. Reducing the paperwork was projected to give about 1 million more Americans health coverage and reduce the out-of-pocket expenses with compliance. So reduce the out-of-pocket costs to us for mailing stuff and for making copies and for driving around to get all the chores done. All of that extra work was costing the poorest Americans in this country cumulatively $87 million per year. And as for the government, the healthcare coverage would have cost about $5 billion per year. And so killing this rule for 10 years makes the opposite true. The extra paperwork is going to cost the poorest Americans $87 million per year out of pocket, and 1 million fewer people will jump over these hurdles and get their health care. And that will theoretically save us $5 billion a year at the cost of our lives. Except it won't, because we know that these people won't just die when they get sick. They will go to the emergency room, and those costs will get passed on to the rest of us in like insurance premiums and local taxes. But the Republicans did a similar thing with a rule that would have streamlined paperwork for Medicaid and other basic health programs. So this other rule would have stopped the states from requiring in-person interviews for people over the age of 65 and for people who are disabled and blind in order for them to get their health coverage. The rule would have required states to use electronic data to check documents verifying income and assets instead of requiring physical paper. And the rule would have prevented people from getting immediately kicked off of their health care just because a piece of mail was returned to the sender being the government. The rule would have required annual renewals, so once per year, one hurdle once per year, preventing the states from requiring paperwork more than once per year to maintain coverage. And these reductions in hurdles were projected to help approximately 1.3 million of the poorest Americans to get health care coverage. But Republicans killed that rule too until 2034, meaning that states can require that elderly, disabled, and blind people do in-person interviews or lose their health care. States can require physical paperwork verifying income and assets instead of allowing them to submit electronic documents. States can kick people off their health care plans just because a piece of paper was returned to sender. And states can require paperwork be submitted more than once per year to maintain coverage. In fact, starting at the beginning of 2027, the Republicans are going to require the states to require paperwork be submitted at least every 6 months. So double the work, double the hurdles. And all of those hurdles are likely to result in approximately 1.3 million of the poorest Americans being unable to jump all of those hurdles and get the healthcare coverage that they qualify for. And this sneaky way of denying us benefits that we qualify for is projected to save about $16.7 billion per year directly. But again, we will pay when these people refuse to die and show up at the hospital anyway without health coverage. Another sneaky way this law cuts benefits is by shifting so many costs onto the states which often do have balanced budget requirements, unlike the federal government, which is able to run up insane debts. But when a state has more expenses than they have revenues, the state either has to raise more in taxes or cut benefits. And the experts seem to think that the cost shifts that I'm about to tell you about are going to result in benefit cuts. So first, the big beautiful law clamps down on the use of provider taxes to inflate Medicaid federal matching funds to basically get the states more Medicaid money. Because under the pre-big beautiful law United States, states could impose provider taxes up to 6%, which are taxes that would be paid by hospitals, nursing homes, labs, stuff like that. That 6% could be of net patient service revenues, and they could still qualify for federal matching funds. And then the taxes were then reimbursed back to those providers. So back to the hospitals, the nursing homes, and labs, essentially costing them nothing. But that resulted in increased Medicaid payments from the state using federal matching funds. So it was basically like a money loop. The provider paid a tax to the state used that to draw down Medicaid dollars, the provider got reimbursed at a higher Medicaid rate, and everyone would win, except the federal government. And so the big beautiful law prevents states who aren't already doing this from starting it, and the states who are doing it will eventually not be able to tax providers at more than 3.5%. And I know this seems like some kind of an accounting scam, but this is actually a big one. In fact, it's the biggest one because it's going to reduce the amount of money that the federal government gives to the states for healthcare by about $20 billion per year. $20 billion that states will either have to find in their already tight budgets or cut healthcare for their residents. Another biggie is the section that just straight up cuts federal payments to states, because the Affordable Care Act expanded Medicaid payments to states that were never supposed to go below 90% of their expenses. But the Republicans are reducing the federal share back to what it was back in like the 1960s, between 50% and 83%, depending on the state. And so what that means is that every single state is getting its funding for healthcare cut by the big, beautiful law. And this shift is projected to take away approximately $9 billion per year from the states, which again, they're going to have to either replace with their own budgets or limit the number of people with healthcare in their state. The Republicans are also reducing our safety net health coverage more directly, because previously Americans could receive up to 3 months of retroactive care before applying for Medicaid. But starting in 2027, that window is only going to be 1 month. And in the case of pregnant women, that's extended to only 2 months. But reducing the retroactive liability period helps states and the federal government save money by lowering the volume of covered pre-enrollment claims. But it means patients either have to pay out of pocket or hospitals have to raise rates to cover the losses for the people who can't pay for the treatments that they already had. And so the billions of dollars saved aren't really saved. They're just going to be shifted to other patients, to hospitals, and to those of us who pay with insurance. And in another cost shift to the rest of us, starting in October of 2026, so 1 month before the next election, the law prohibits federal funding to be used to reimburse health care for anyone who is not a citizen or permanent resident. And this means that states will not be paid for treating tourists or diplomats or students who are here to study and who then intend to move home, even though hospitals and emergency care centers are required to treat everyone. This means that states and the providers will have to find a way for the care for all of the non-citizens who need health care and refuse to just kindly die. And that means the costs will shift to those of us who do pay and to our insurance companies, who will raise our premiums to cover the costs and their profits. And by the way, many of those people who need care will go to emergency rooms because emergency rooms can't turn people away. And so even if you're wealthy, your money doesn't do shit when you're in the back of a long emergency room line. This will affect us all. And now that I look at this, I keep saying that people won't be denied care. They'll just go to the emergency rooms and the payments will be shifted. But this next one does seem like it legalizes some straight up denials of care. Because starting in October of 2028, so 1 month before the next presidential election and well after the midterm, so this can be stopped. But if we learn nothing and we vote Republican and this doesn't get reversed, Medicaid recipients at or above the poverty level, which is only $15,650 for one person. I told you in the beginning that usually it doubles. That doesn't double for 2 people in a family. So it's $21,150 for a couple and $32,150 for a family of 4, which is just, it's so little money. I can't even imagine making ends meet on that income level. But people who are making that little will now have to pay out-of-pocket charges like copays, unless they are being treated at federally qualified health centers, rural healthcare clinics, or certified community behavioral health clinics. But everywhere else, they have to be charged at least $1, but can be charged $35 per visit. And the total costs can't be more than 5% of the family's income. So there's just going to be a whole bunch of paperwork here too. But the bill allows providers to require these payments up front before they have to give care to that individual. Which seems like if they don't give any money up front, if they don't get the money from these people who make so little, it sounds like these people can be denied care. And I know that $35 might not sound like a lot to a lot of us, but can you imagine making only $15,650 for an entire year? For having only $1,304 per month? Like, I can't fathom living off of that. And so like $35 for someone making that little money, $35 for someone making $15,650 is like a $225 upfront charge for someone making $100,000. That's a lot of money out of pocket to see a doctor. Like, I would basically have to be dying before I will pay a $225 copay. And so the proportionality of a $35 charge, that's just brutal. And people are going to stop getting healthcare unless it is absolutely necessary because the Republicans chose to do this. But the Republicans don't want to look like monsters. And so to make up for all of these healthcare cuts, the Republicans appropriated $10 billion per year for the next 5 years for rural healthcare facilities. So $50 billion total, because it is projected that there are going to be hospitals that close because of this. Because as you heard, a lot of costs are being shifted onto them because the feds are no longer going to pay for like tourists and students and non-citizens. The hospitals are just going to have to eat it, and some of them won't be able to. And so for rural hospitals in particular, they will get $50 billion a year for just the next 5 years. After that, they're fucked. But I also want to point out that that doesn't come close to filling the permanent funding hole that the other provisions create. And it does absolutely nothing at all to help the people without healthcare coverage and the hospitals in all of those dirty, dirty blue cities. And it wasn't just healthcare benefit costs that were shifted to the states. They also shifted food benefit money to the states too. And so right now, and until 2028, SNAP food benefits are paid for by the federal government, not the states, even though the states manage the food distribution systems. But starting in 2028, the Big Beautiful Law sets federal government payments for food benefits for states based on their performance in managing the system. And Republicans want to financially punish states that make mistakes in administering the food benefit system. So a state that has an error rate under 6%, as in a state that overpays or underpays under 6% of the claims, they would continue to have all of their food benefits paid for by the federal government. So it's like, good job to them. But a state with an error rate between 6 and 8% will have to pay 5% of their state's food benefits. A state with an error rate between 8 and 10% will have to pay 10% of their state's food benefits. And a state with an error rate above 10% would have to find money in their budget to pay for the remaining 15% of food benefits, which is why this provision is considered a likely large cut, because states with high error rates are likely to struggle to come up with that much money in their budgets, and so they're likely to cut benefits when they can't. And the experts do seem to think that quickly changing their systems to dramatically lower their error rates is not practical. And I don't know why, but this is clearly considered a cost shift to the states by people who know things. And on top of that, the One Big Beautiful Law makes the SNAP program more expensive for the states to manage, because instead of the federal government paying for half of the administration costs for the states, starting in 2027, the federal government is only going to pay a quarter of the costs. So they have basically slashed the administrative budget for the states in half. And so this means that many states will not only have to start paying for between 5 and 15% of the food benefits themselves, depending on their error rate, but no matter what, they will have to find room in their budgets to pay for a quarter of the management costs directly too, that they are not accustomed to paying for. But here's the other favor to Alaska's Senator Lisa Murkowski. This was the biggest favor granted to her because in order to get her vote for a bill that she was against, she was very vocal about that. The bill includes a temporary provision that rewards states with the highest error rates with a multi-year exemption from having to pay for any food benefits. And this is because Alaska has the highest error rate in the country. Their error rate is almost 25%. And so instead of Alaska being punished for their high error rate, the One Big Beautiful Law pushes off the punishment date for the worst performing states to 2029 or 2030 instead of 2028, which essentially means that Alaska and other poor performing states will continue to have the federal government pay 100% of their residents' food benefit costs for a few extra years. It's essentially a reward for their poor performance. But the intention was for Lisa Murkowski to get a reward for Trump's bill, despite knowing that it would hurt millions of people. And check out the response of the Republicans when this was brought up in the Rules Committee debate in the House. Remember, this debate happened a few hours after the Senate voted. So this was after Senator Lisa Murkowski had already voted yes. And the House Republicans were pushing the bill through the House with no amendments allowed, purely so that they could hand it to Trump to sign on July 4th, because that's what he wanted. And so here's Democrat Joe Neguse of Colorado pointing out how the states can game the system to get their food benefits covered for 4 years using the Murkowski loophole. And the Republican response will come from Republican Austin Scott of Georgia.
In Maryland, the SNAP error rate right now is 8.85%. In North Carolina, it's 8.11%. So under this bill, right, assuming it's enacted into law, the state of Maryland and the state of North Carolina have really only three choices. One, raise taxes to essentially pay for what is a cost share that's never been imposed on states before. 2, cut SNAP funding and force countless vulnerable citizens to no longer have access to food assistance. Or 3, this new option, which is increase your error rate above 13%. So basically overpay SNAP or underpay, you choose. But make sure that your program is not working appropriately. And if you can get to 13%, you can join the 10 states that have such poor error rates that they're exempted from any kind of cost share for 4 years, including the state of Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Actually, only a Democrat state would actually intentionally increase their error rates. A Republican state would work to reduce them. And
well, that's fascinating. If that's the case.
Not an option you mentioned.
Well, if that's the case, and I didn't yield to the gentleman, but in any event.
But you did forget that one.
I hear you. I will simply say this. If that's the case, then you could just remove them entirely. Why include these 10 states as part of this deal if apparently Republican states are so committed to reducing the error rate on their own volition? Why don't you have that cost share start tomorrow? Clearly, that's not the case. Clearly, Republicans in the U.S. Senate. What was that?
I'd be fine with the.
Then you should vote against the bill. You have an opportunity tomorrow to make that clear. Well, that's unfortunately, I assume that'll be fine for the people of Georgia because, as I said, they're exempted from this, so they don't have to worry about that. But the people of North Carolina do, as do the people of Maryland.
This reward for the states with the worst performance records, which also serves as an incentive for the decently performing states to do worse for a few years, was inserted by the Senate and was clearly impossible for the House Republicans to defend. If this bill had been crafted slowly in order to get it right, this provision never would have survived scrutiny by the House. But this was not a carefully crafted bill. And let's talk about that for a minute, because I think it's important to know just how carelessly this bill became law. And you should know that the Republicans knew it. All of them knew it. Here's an exchange in the Rules Committee meeting that gets started by Republican, Chip Roy of Texas. And in this clip, he's speaking to a panel of other members of the House who are chairs and ranking members of their committees. And so he's going to be answered by Pennsylvania Republican Glenn Thompson. The lady you will hear from is a Democratic representative named Angie Craig of Minnesota. Then you'll hear from Republican Jody Arrington, Democrat Brendan Boyle, Republican Brett Guthrie, Democrat Frank Pallone, Democrat Gwen Moore, and Republican Jason Smith.
Can you just tell me whether you've been able to read the Senate bill as it came over from the Senate before testifying here today? Can we just go down the line? Yourself, have you been able to read the Senate bill?
Just within the scope of the agriculture title. So the changes that were made there.
You're able to read the changes to the bill?
The summaries of them, the items that they made.
Ranking member?
No.
Chairman?
I am reading through it as we speak.
You're reading the bill?
I have not read through the entirety of it.
So you have not read it, you're reading through the bill while we're here?
Correct.
Right.
We continue.
Ranking member?
Yeah, actually my answer is exactly the same as Jody's.
Chairman?
We're reading the wraparound, reading the wraparound amendment that affected our area. Briefly, not word for word, to get familiar with the changes before we came here, and we'll be reading it tonight.
Ranking member.
My reaction is the same as Chairman Guthrie. We tried as quickly as possible to get through it, but we only had like an hour before we had to come here, so no, I've not been able to read the whole thing or
Chairman Smith.
Just to read summaries, particularly relating to our jurisdiction on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Chairman Smith.
The tax provisions we've been following throughout the whole process. The bill that was, the language was dropped on Saturday. I'm very well aware of everything that's in that. The wraparound amendment that was a couple hours ago, I know the details of it, but I know the tax provisions.
None of them, not one of them, could claim to know the whole bill as well as I now know it because this bill took me 3 weeks to read. Our members of the House only had hours. And even in the Senate, they were working so fast and through a weekend that some of the final text was written by hand in the margins of the bill. The Senate parliamentarian was forced to have to rule on provisions because they did amend the bill in the Senate. But she was having to make her rulings, saying if each provision followed the rules and were allowed in the bill in real time. She didn't even have time to really process this stuff. It was an atrocious, reckless process for creating a law that's going to impact us in so many ways. A bill that legalizes indefinite detention on U.S. soil, that guts our environmental protections, that kicks millions of us off health coverage, and we haven't even touched the tax and corporate welfare provisions yet. These were huge decisions, and this process made it literally impossible for those decisions to be fully thought through before setting them in stone. And the Republicans knew it. Here's Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina in the Rules Committee.
The founders and the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence would be astounded that we're sitting here talking about something that we hadn't read fully. We hadn't got a copy of it. Now, Mr. McGovern, I do agree with you on that. The fact that we should have it in hand. So I'm against this because of what the Senate did. I'll vote against it here, and I'll vote against it on the floor until we get it right. And the fact is, the good news, we're going to pass the tax cuts. The tax cuts don't expire until the December of this year. We're going to pass the tax cuts. And I think we're going to go back to the drawing table. It is my hope we'll go back to the drawing table and get very close to what we sent the Senate, because instead of each individual senator getting a goodie bag and sacrificing the health of this country is an abomination to, again, the founders and the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence.
And Jim McGovern, a Democrat on the Rules Committee who can do basic math, after this announcement by Ralph Norman, realized that along with the other Republicans like Tom Massey of Kentucky and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, who had announced that they weren't going to vote for the bill, Norman was bringing the Republicans closer to a defeat on the bill. And so here's the exchange between Jim McGovern and Ralph Norman when McGovern realized that.
I think we just have another announcement of somebody who's opposed to the bill. Are you opposed to the rule too?
Yes, I'm going to vote against the rule, and I'm going to vote against.
So that's three. If we get one more, then we're done for today, and you can go and work out something different. So I don't know why we're here if we already know three people who are going to vote against the rule. We're not even get this thing to the floor unless you cave, which has become a kind of a pattern around here. But I yield back.
And Jim McGovern called it. Ralph Norman caved. He voted for the bill, along with all House Republicans except for Tom Massey and Brian Fitzpatrick. And they all knew that this process was wrong, that this bill was too long and too impactful to be passed this way. They knew that there was crazy stuff in there, like the Murkowski loophole that will reward states for fucking up their food stamp programs. And they knew that was in there. That was being talked about widely in Washington on that day. But they voted for this version of the bill anyway. Why? Donald Trump. Here's Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio. This is the guy who took Vice President J.B. Vance's seat when he left to go be in the Trump administration. But here's Senator Moreno on the Senate floor expressing his thoughts about why he thought the Democrats could possibly be against this law.
At least be honest about your objection to the bill, and their objection to the bill is pretty straightforward. They don't want President Trump to get a win.
It's all about Trump to them. This was simply a win for Trump, which they see as a win for their party, the end. The contents, not that important. Moreno couldn't fathom that Democrats or regular people like me would have legit objections to indefinite detention of children, or fake nurses in for-profit nursing homes, or millions of people kicked off their health insurance, or a long list of ways in which this law will physically hurt us, whether it's from pollution that they are allowing spewed into our air and water, or the greenhouse gas emissions that threaten all of our homes. No, it's all about Trump. Trump wanted this by July 4th, and he had it by July 4th. What a pathetic flock of sheep the House Republicans are. They knew what they were doing was wrong on a few different levels, and they did it anyway. And speaking of wrong, I have a few more things to tell you in this episode, so let's get back to food, because they aren't just taking food away from people who need help with hurdles. They are just straight up taking away the food from families that they deem to be too large. So the Thrifty Food Plan is a U.S. Department of Agriculture food plan designed to reflect the lowest cost nutritious diet for a family preparing meals at home. So basically, this pretend family is used to determine the maximum amount of money a family gets for food stamps. Well, in the big, beautiful law, they changed the definition of thrifty food plan so that the size of the family is limited. It does so by prohibiting a family from getting more than double the amount that a family of 4 would get. So basically, no more than 8 portions of food, regardless of the number of people in the family. So any human being who's in a family of 9 or more either needs to ration their food allowances to split it amongst everyone in the family, or they let their extra family members fall right through the safety net. And I just want to remind you that no matter how much money you have in the bank right now, the safety net for poor people is your safety net too. In this country, an illness can bankrupt us faster than any of us think. And this law, my upper middle class friend, it comes for you too. Because starting in 2028, the new law makes people ineligible for Medicaid-funded long-term care services, so like long-term nursing home care, if they own a home valued at more than $1 million, which is an increase from current law, but that number is not going to increase with inflation anymore. But $1 million home in some parts of this country is basically a 2-bedroom shack. A lot of Americans who aren't wealthy have homes valued at over $1 million. And so what this means is that if you or your parents, because I know I'm thinking about my mom, if you have a home but need long-term nursing home care, which is extremely expensive, the family home needs to be sold. It doesn't matter if you have other family members who are living in it, or if the home has been in the family for generations and your family wants to keep it. That house needs to be sold before the government will help with healthcare costs, which again, in other countries, are considered essential societal services. We are unique in requiring poverty and the sale of family homes in order to get basic end-of-life care. And lest you believe that the hurdles to healthcare coverage were only aimed at the poors and the olds, you would be mistaken because of something crucial to many of us middle-class working Americans that was conspicuously left out of the bill. Because the new law does not extend enhanced premium tax credits for private health insurance in the health insurance marketplaces, which are nicknamed the Obamacare exchanges. These are the websites that people like me use, in fact, actual me has used, to buy health insurance coverage because I don't work for anyone else. And so when husband Joe is not tied to a corporation, the Obamacare exchanges are where we go to buy insurance on our own. Now, most people who get their healthcare coverage from their boss have at least part of their coverage covered by their bosses. That's their subsidy. But for people like me who create our own businesses, we get our subsidy as an actual government subsidy, as in the government helps us pay for our health insurance if we make under 400% of the poverty level. Right now, that's about $62,000 per year for a single person. Since COVID, those of us who have our insurance via the exchanges have gotten used to having more generous subsidies because the government actually wanted us to have health coverage during a global pandemic. But that's no longer the case. The exchange subsidies are going to go down to pre-COVID levels, and the Congressional Budget Office estimates that that will result in a loss of coverage for another 5 million Americans who are not poor, who are not elderly, who are working, and are middle-class Americans. So that is part 1 of what was in the big, beautiful law. And so the next episode is going to be all about the money. It's going to be about the damn tax cuts and about the welfare for some corporations and the punishments for others. But I wanted to focus on these provisions first because these are the parts of the law, many of which are somehow flying under the radar of our shameful, political drama-obsessed media. But these parts of the law, these are going to change our society. And I don't like what I see in my crystal ball. Because I see innocent men, women, and children locked in prisons. Because I see quickly hired, inadequately trained, masked, and armed ICE agents violently kidnapping people with impunity and eventually killing people. They themselves seem to think that that's inevitable. I see increasing natural disasters, floods, fires, storm surges that wipe out more American neighborhoods. More American cities, Paradise, Lahaina, Mexico City Beach, the Pacific Palisades, Altadena, all of them gone, all since 2018. I see more cancer diagnoses due to increasing pollution and more people dying, or turning to crime a la Walter White in order to pay for their increased out-of-pocket costs for already outrageously expensive healthcare in the United States. I see medical bankruptcies causing more hungry and homeless people. And I see more violent crime, more robberies, because hungry and homeless people don't just die when left with nothing and nowhere to turn, as much as the Republicans in power may wish that they would. I see a United States that is scarier and a more dangerous place on so many levels. This law is not about tax cuts, although they're in there. This law is so much more than that. This is a fundamental shift in our national safety. They've authorized mass imprisonment without trials, and they cut huge holes in our safety net. All of us will feel the effects. And I thought about trying to record this episode in my neutral tone, or as neutral a tone as I can muster, but I just couldn't do it. I hate this law. I hate this law more than any other law that I've read for this show in the past almost 13 years. And the Republicans, in my opinion, can take their tax cuts and shove them up their asses. I'm getting a tax cut, and I don't want it. But it doesn't matter what I want or what you want, clearly. The Republicans did what Trump wants. And so next episode, I'll tell you about the damn tax cuts. And you can decide for yourself if they're worth becoming a savage, corporate, secret police state to get them. So I'd like to take a second here and just thank you for supporting my work, whether you're someone who has been supporting it already or you're going to support it in the future, because I do find that the longer people listen to my work, they do end up supporting it in some kind of financial form, which I appreciate so much. And you're the reason that I've been able to do this job for almost 13 years. The 13-year anniversary is coming up in September. And so with 13 years of experience doing this, with 13 years of practice, reading this bill, this law, it was really hard. And years ago, there's no way I would have been able to finish this in under a month at 840 pages. But the experience that your support has afforded me has made me more efficient at reading these laws. And I've got to say, I feel like I'm getting pretty good at this. And because I have become so confident in your support, I also feel like I'm just getting started. I know this may sound weird, but the production of this episode was tough for me because the contents of it, I hate. I don't think that I hid that in any way in this episode or on We're Not Wrong. So there was some depression that came along with the production of this episode. But there were also quite a few moments where I realized that being able to produce this gave me some hope and is definitely helping me sleep at night despite my concerns. The reason for that is that this podcast gives me agency. Like reading this law and being able to tell you about it in detail and to share my opinion about it, it helps me sleep at night because I feel like I am doing something. Like I feel like I'm spending my working hours doing my part. And I truly believe that in helping me, so are you. And I do have to say that the people who have helped me the most are the executive producers of Congressional Dish. Now, executive producers are people who have paid a significant portion of an episode's production. So they get an executive producer credit every time they pay $535. And some people do this in lump sum. Some people, it takes years to accumulate, and then they put their credit on an episode. But I mean, these are the people who have invested in this project, and they get credit for that investment on the episode that they feel most proud to have co-produced. Their names are literally on the episode. And executive producers are what create our most valuable episodes list, which is where I send all of the new people for Congressional Dish. And I've got to tell you, I think this executive producer system is working beyond what I ever expected. It's so good because I look at the top 5 episodes right now. Number 1 is War Money, which is the history of Israel, which I think is so important right now. Number 2 is Contriving January 6th, which summarizes the January 6th committee testimony and the full plot to keep Trump in power in 2020. It was so far beyond the riot. I feel like when we think of January 6th, we just think of the Bumpkin riot. We don't know the full plot in this country. That makes me crazy. And I tell people a lot that episode I feel like is my masterpiece because I summarized 20 hours of testimony in 2 hours, and I think I did a damn good job. Number 3 is WTF is the Federal Reserve, because who the f knows what the Federal Reserve is? So I think that's an important, valuable episode. Number 4 is Minerals is the New Oil. Kind of looked at the global map and realized that in 2003, we overthrew Iraq in order to secure the supply of fossil fuels for fossil fuel corporations. And so much of what we were doing was based on oil. Rare earth minerals is the next version of that. And so much of what we're doing when it comes to China has to do with the global game of who controls the minerals. So that's the fourth most valuable episode, according to our producers. And then the fifth is the National Endowment for Democracy episode, which has been at the top for years and years and years. And that's a part of our government that a lot of people don't even realize exists. And its structure is bonkers. There's members of Congress on this thing, even though it's funded by Congress. So it's kind of a way for members of Congress to funnel money to themselves to help regime change other countries. It's bonkers. It's crazy. And so when I look at those 5 episodes, I go, yeah, yeah, I can see those being the most valuable episodes. And so I am excited after doing an episode like this. Like, I'm excited to see how many executive producers this one gets. But we do have a few executive producers to announce for 2 episodes and 2 executive producer credits. And so first we have an anonymous, because you don't have to put your name on it if you want to. The credit still moves these episodes up the list and it's listed as anonymous, but it does prove to people that this episode is considered valuable. So we have an anonymous credit now going on Congressional Dish 189, which was the first step prison reform episode. And a message was sent in along with this executive producer credit. The message says, as if you don't have enough on your plate with the blatantly bogus bill. Ooh, I like that nickname. I was thinking it may be time to take another look at Geo Group and Core Civic. With more money in this budget for new prisons than the entire Homeland Security budgets in the past, those 2 corporations will be real-time examples of waste, fraud, and abuse. You're right. I did talk about them, though, in the episode 317. I mentioned them in this one, but I think you put your executive producer credit on a really good episode to move that topic up, because I did talk about that in the first step prison reform, and which is why I am guessing you put your credit on that episode, but that's going to move it up the list. Thank you for doing that. But yeah, I'm super concerned about what's going on with the prisons. Like, in the middle of the episode, I think you could hear I was trying to like do a hierarchy, but between indefinite detention and the environment stuff, which is like cancer and climate change, that feels like existential for like humanity. If you listen to some of the client scientists, not that anyone says that like all humans will die, but our civilization is quite fragile. Something that was in the news this week, which is crazy. There's an island nation that they are starting the process of evacuating the entire nation. Eventually, the people that are living there will be climate refugees in Australia. But that is where we're at with this. Like, nations are disappearing. So that's scary. And then the health stuff obviously is going to like kill people. So I don't know how to do the hierarchy of bad. I'm in Los Angeles for the summer. And so I'm very close to the parts of Los Angeles where people are just being like snatched up off the street. I played one of the clips from KTLA 5. That's a Los Angeles station where there was a girl. She was just walking to work and they snatched her. She was a U.S. citizen and she was held until she was able to prove she was a U.S. citizen. But that's really scary. And that can happen to people. It can happen to any of us, really. It can happen to any of us. Like, I am very, very white. So I have less fear about that for me personally, because I think it is race-based. That quote from that cop where he was like, you're an amigo, for the reason that this guy doesn't have rights. Like, this is so clearly racist. But I have people in my life that are not white. And so I worry for all of us, really. But yeah, thanks for putting a credit on that episode. I'm glad that one's moving up the list. I also want to thank our executive producer, Ray Gunawardena, who is now an EP on our 269th episode, which is the defense authorization episode from 2023. This was the one where I highlighted our plans when it comes to Ecuador. It was called Plan Ecuador. And so Ray sent in a message which says, I would love to use my other EP credit on episode 269, NDA 2023 Plan Ecuador. I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador, teaching English at a girls' secondary school in the capital of Quito. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And traveled around the country, both training teachers and assisting and running English camps during school breaks. It was an incredible experience, and I learned so much about the gorgeous country. And of course, I learned Spanish, which I now use almost daily, especially as a teacher to students learning English as a second or additional language. I learned a lot about the US government and its involvement in Ecuador's government. Although I knew some of the information already from having lived there, I'm grateful for the experience and even more grateful to have Jen's podcast to help educate others. I'm thrilled to attach my name to it. Thank you. Well, thank you for putting your name on that one. I actually don't know if that has any EPs on it. So you're like putting it on the list, I believe. I'm not sure. I haven't actually looked at that, but I know it's not near the top. And I also think that's an important episode because it also shows like how we use our gifts to manipulate other countries into doing what we want them to do, and how some of our gifts are just like ways to funnel money to our own companies. So yeah, that was a fascinating episode. Thank you for putting your name on it. And Ray, of course, thank you for supporting the show for all these years. I mean, I've said your name so many times that I think I actually know how to say it now. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys. As soon as I stop recording this, first of all, I'm going to sleep. My brain is completely fried, but I start again tomorrow. I'm going to get out that tax cut part of the law episode to you as fast as I can. And then I'm going to take some time off in August because I'm tired. I'm tired on like a physical level from reading this bill, but also just like on a spiritual level. I'm doing these last week in Congress episodes for the patrons, and I find them extremely valuable. So do the patrons, but it's a lot of extra work. And so right now we're having a conversation over in the green room and on Patreon because, whatever. If you know, you know. But yeah, over on Patreon, we're having a discussion about like how I continue this because the pace is a lot. And like I said, this month I've produced 5 episodes for Patreon, which took time away from doing this, but those episodes for Patreon are keeping me current on what's going on in Congress. So I don't want to stop doing them, but I don't know. I don't know how to find the balance here because this month of July, like I said, like I'm going to be paid significantly less than I usually am. And yet I have produced so much more to the point that like I'm starting to feel burned out again. And we can't have that. So yeah, I'm going to finish the Big Beautiful Bill project and then I'm taking at least 2 weeks. I need to think about things. So yes, thank you for supporting this work. The break is going to be to help this podcast continue into the future. I still have a goal of doing at least 500 of these episodes. So that's still a lot of years ahead of me. And I'm going to need your help. So please support the show and please share the show. One of the reasons that we're not struggling financially, but like we're struggling financially is because I just keep trying to squeeze this same audience for money. What we really need to do is grow the audience. And I'm in a weird spot because I have enough money now. Like I didn't get paid to do this for 5 years, So I'm making enough money now to where I have a very nice life. I live in decent places. My husband and I are digital nomads, if you don't know that. And so we travel around. We live in like 1-bedroom apartments or in hotels when we travel. So I'm living the dream. Like creating this podcast, when I think about why I do it personally and why I started it, it was so that I could follow my husband's job around. I haven't decided how much I want to talk about this publicly, but like the Big Beautiful Bill, my husband is a solar engineer. And so it's going to affect us personally. We're a little worried about it, but I have the flexibility because this is my career to be able to move around. So it's like this job is giving me the lifestyle that I wanted. And I have enough money now to where I'm not constantly worried about money, but I don't have enough money to market this damn thing because that costs thousands of dollars a month. And I just don't have that much room in my budget. So it's like, it's a weird catch-22 because I need a larger audience in order to make more money, in order to market the show to get the larger audience. So at some point, I know I'm just going to have to like buckle up and spend the money and reinvest, but I don't want to go spending money on marketing until I have an actual plan. And I don't really have that right now. And so you're my marketing department. So please share this episode. I would greatly appreciate that. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is all right.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.